I've been asked to give an informal presentation on the subject of new urbanism, but issues attending urbanism and architecture, which are of a piece, are inherently complex, and it's not easy to talk briefly even about new urbanism. Moreover, I fear that my lecture style is congenitally pedantic, and that tonight will be no exception. To compensate, therefore, I'm going to do my quixotic best to synthesize both thoroughness and brevity in the hope of leaving ample time for question and answer and a more informal discussion afterwards. Actually, I wrote this when I was hoping to keep this to 40 minutes, and now it's looking like it might be about 50 minutes. I hope I can get it in 50 minutes. 60 slides. I have to stay away from there. 60 slides, 50 minutes, but I hope we'll have time for a lot of question and answer afterwards, as much as you're interested in pursuing. So I begin with two propositions. First, that good cities are an essential component of the good life for human beings. And second, that post-World War II suburban sprawl is the antithesis of good urbanism, and we therefore ought to look for a way to do things differently. Whether these propositions are true is something that we can discuss during the question and answer session. I recognize that for many who have never lived in a city and cannot imagine themselves doing so, this is an astonishing, implausible, and perhaps even unbelievable claim. But I don't expect my arguments to persuade anybody who has never lived in a city and can't imagine doing so. Indeed, much of my argument will perhaps make sense only to those who have some acquaintance with cities. But this, of course, reiterates a point made by Aristotle himself in the Nicomachean Ethics, that one does not learn a virtue first by learning a theory about the virtue, but rather by engaging in activities in which the virtue itself is learned by its pre-theoretical exercise. Only after one has an actual acquaintance with one or more virtues is one able to understand the moral theory of virtue ethics. So it is perhaps with understanding the goods of city life. In any case, my purpose this evening is to briefly discuss the nature and purpose of cities in historical context, look more closely at both the formal order of traditional cities and the formal order of post-1945 suburbia, and finally discuss new urbanism as an effort to promote traditional urbanism in a physical and cultural context of sprawl. Cannot hear me in the back? All right, see what we can do. Oh, well, I can for now, but when I start shifting pages and pointing the pointer and stuff, it's going to, I'll need a third hand. Is this any better? All right. You know, actually, Milton, I could ask you to just forward. You can forward things when I say slide. So, okay, is this better? Slide.
Forward. Is that forward?
There we go. That's forward on the right. So, Western notions about good cities descend from Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome, and the ideas that are associated with them. From Athens, we inherit two seminal ideas: that the good life is the life of moral and intellectual excellence, and that a good city makes such a life possible for its citizens. From Jerusalem comes a third idea, that a city's excellence is also measured by the care it exhibits for its weakest members. And from Rome, we inherit the idea that a city's beauty is warranted by and represents its greatness. This ancient view of cities, though it acknowledged the central role of commerce, was essentially moral and aesthetic. Today's common wisdom is different. It views the city as governed by impersonal market forces and devotes little thought to the good life or to what relation cities might have to the good life. Slide. The city is also a central metaphor and theme of historic Christianity. Christian scripture depicts the end of history as the New Jerusalem, and the relationship between this world and the next was articulated paradigmatically for Christians in the 5th century in St. Augustine's The City of God. St. Augustine here depicted on the right side of this slide of famous converts. Next. Systematic philosophical thinking about urbanism antedates Christianity, however, going back to Aristotle, who wrote some 4 centuries before Christ that the best life for individual human beings is the life of moral and intellectual virtue lived in community with others, and most particularly in a polis. Slide. The Greek polis, or city-state, was typically small in scale, with flexible but definite physical and geographic characteristics. It happened also to approximate the size of subsequent historic towns and urban neighborhoods. And this, for what viewed historically, seems an obvious reason. It is an area that can be comfortably walked, and its size fits the embodied nature of the human person. I should say something about this slide right here, that whenever you see in the slides that follow an orange circle, that represents a half-mile diameter, 1/2 mile diameter. So it's a quarter-mile radius, which means that it's a 5-minute walk from the center to the edge, and it's a 10-minute walk across from edge to edge. So this is the city of Priene, Turkey. As it was in the 3rd century, it was actually planned prior to that, according to the design is attributed to Hippodamus. Next slide. This is Skaneateles, New York. If any of you know upstate New York and the Finger Lakes, the half-mile diameter slide. This is Hanover, New Hampshire, location of Dartmouth. Here's the green. Oh, this is next. Little bigger city, Savannah, Georgia. You think that's better? Is it gonna? Okay, all right. It's a group operation here. This is Savannah, Georgia. Next. This is the it's Lewisburg Square, but it's Beacon Hill in Boston, half-mile diameter. Next slide. A mile by a half mile is the area of Back Bay. Next slide. This is half-mile diameter around the corner of Addison and Clark in Chicago, and the mix of uses attendant or adjacent to Wrigley Field.
What's that huge, is that Wrigley Field in the middle?
This is Wrigley Field, just right there. Can you see that? Okay. Next slide. And this is Disneyland, and actually I'm glad you're laughing because I mean this is the original Disneyland in Anaheim, and of course one of the criticisms that new urbanists hear frequently, or neo-traditionalists hear frequently, is that we're trying to Disneyfy the world. But as a matter of fact, Walt Disney made Disneyland in accordance with traditional urban principles. Now Disney World is not like that, but if any of you have ever been to Disneyland and to the old Disneyland, there it is in this half-mile diameter circle. There it is, right there in the upper right. For your consideration. Next. Now, Aristotle's argument really constitutes two claims about the good life for human beings. One about the centrality of moral and intellectual virtue, the other about the centrality of the polis. And these were the subject matters of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Politics, respectively. I can't overemphasize the importance of the virtues and virtue ethics to any serious thinking about cities today, but my remarks this evening focus primarily upon the formal order of traditional cities. Next. But if Aristotle is the intellectual wellspring of Western thinking about cities, it was Augustine who identified most clearly a peculiar and distinctive character of the individual and corporate Christian life and vocation, which is that Christians are members of two cities, an earthly city and a heavenly city, the city of man and the city of God. In Augustine's view of things, the church is a sacramental mystery that seeks to make her members over the course of a lifetime fit citizens for the city of God. And we become thus, in part, by learning to be good citizens in the city of man, loving the city of man with a properly ordered love, but not forgetting our first loyalty to the heavenly city that is our origin and destiny. Aristotle wrote of the polis that it is a community of communities, the highest of all, embracing all the rest, aiming at the highest good, the well-being of all its citizens. Now, at one level, a Christian might say that this is not quite right, inasmuch as the church would be characterized as the highest of all communities, aiming at the highest good, the eternal well-being of all its citizens. But here again, Augustine addresses this tension in a way that became definitive for Christians. He contended that in its life on earth, the church is but a single member of and participant in that community of communities which is the earthly city. With respect to her divine vocation, however, the church represents and to some extent embodies the heavenly city. Pace Aristotle, then, the highest of all communities, therefore, is indeed a city, It is the city of God, of which the church is its earthly herald, symbol, and sacramental anticipation. Christians recognize that on earth we have no lasting Jerusalem, but seek the transfigured Jerusalem that is to come. Christians therefore possess a dual citizenship. Next slide. Aristotle argued that human beings are by nature social animals that thrive in cities. Historically, Christians have agreed, but maintain that nature and human sociability and good cities themselves reflect the inherent sociability of the one triune God. It is therefore important not to regard Augustine's use of the term city as mere metaphor. Both Alistair MacIntyre and Peter Brown, writing about the classical polis and Augustine, respectively, have emphasized that in the pre-modern world, human identity was bound up with particular communities and particular places. This indeed was essential to the appeal of Augustine's thesis. Christians belong to a city, a heavenly city, God's city. It also seems worth noting that the modern disintegration of the traditional city, which I will discuss shortly, followed not long after the triumph of the modern notion of the self as autonomous, disembodied, ahistorical, and characterized by a strong will and the presumption that the self is self-created by the will, operating freely in its construction. In the Western world, urban social life as both reality and ideal became problematic with the rise of the industrial city. As recently as the 18th century, Samuel Johnson could write of London, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford." Next slide. But with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the urban setting became known as the site of pollution, disease, squalor, crime, and ugliness. William Blake wrote of England's dark satanic mills. Charles Dickens' novel Hard Times describes the prototypical industrial city of Coketown in urban terms more hellish than heavenly. And the city came to be seen as the exactly proper setting for the noir novels of Raymond Chandler and noir movies like The Big Sleep, The Maltese Falcon, Chinatown, Blade Runner, The Untouchables, and most recently, Batman. At the same time, the harshness of the Industrial Revolution fostered a series of ameliorative movements that continue to this day. Every major urban reform movement of the past 200 years, from England's 19th century Hygiene Acts to the American City Beautiful movement, to modern zoning laws, to modernist architecture, to the creation of suburbia, to urban renewal, to public housing, to the rise of environmentalism, historic preservation, and new urbanism, all of these have been a response of some kind to the social and cultural disruptions created by modern industrialism. Several of these reform movements, such as the 19th century urban parks movement, without which contemporary big city life would be almost unlivable, have made permanent contributions to our experience and understanding of good city life. Others have been and remain more problematic. The problems, however, are not simply with the current state of the natural and man-made physical environment, but are cultural as well. Next slide. In 1835, in Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville famously wrote that democratic societies have an inherent, if inadvertent, tendency to promote the then novel phenomenon not of selfishness, but of individualism. But what Tocqueville long ago recognized as individualist culture in potential is today individualist culture realized, and it finds expression in a variety of modes. One mode is the oppositional, convention-shattering ethos, an ethos that itself is now a convention, in the small but highly publicized world of high design architecture and most of architectural education. Next slide. Another is the American enthusiasm for spirituality divorced from institutional religious discipline, a phenomenon once dryly identified and simultaneously critiqued by Villanova University's Eugene McCarahar when he wrote that, quote, "I think of myself as religious, but not spiritual." Partial to the sensuous, communal, and cerebral forms of ritual and text, I've always considered spirituality too ethereal and invertebrate a way of being, end quote. Next slide. But arguably, the most pervasive physical manifestation of contemporary individualist culture is post-1945 American suburban sprawl. Without suggesting that people who today live in cities are by that fact alone more moral or even less individualistic than people who live in post-1945 suburbs, I nevertheless contend that the post-1945 American suburb is the physical form and apotheosis of this democratic cultural tendency toward individualism first identified by Tocqueville. The post-1945 suburb is, in a very precise sense, an anti-spatial world, a world of unprecedented private luxury that is simultaneously a world of unprecedented public spatial poverty. In contrast, space is the medium of traditional urban life. It is where most of public life in traditional pre-1945 cities takes place. And by traditional urban life, I mean not only dense historic urban centers, next slide, not only historic urban centers, but also, next slide, traditional city neighborhoods, next slide, and traditional small towns. Space in these places is not a vague or ethereal or slippery or amorphous concept. Rather, urban spaces possess specific names that denote a variety of specific spatial types. Slide. The park. Slide. Oh, go back. The mall. Slide. The common. Slide. The plaza. Slide. The square. Slide. The boulevard. Slide. The avenue. Slide. The street. Slide. The alley. Traditional urban spaces, all. Now, at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, we try to look at cities and architecture holistically, and are known, some would say are notorious, for our curricular focus upon traditional architecture and urban design. Part of what this means in practice is that we study architecture in the context and as a component of cities, and that urbanism, therefore, has a kind of priority even over architecture, insofar as we believe and teach that architecture properly understood serves civic purposes. We hold a positive estimation of cities and participate in that long, pre-modern, and embattled tradition that views cities as good things, as a community of communities, the purpose of which is to promote the good life of its inhabitants. A city, in this or any other view, is a dynamic interplay of environmental, economic, moral, and formal orders. And as architects and urban designers, our primary focus at Notre Dame is upon the latter of these, the physical and spatial formal order of traditional cities. In focusing here upon traditional urban formal order, I'm distinguishing between the way in which human beings made settlements before about 1930 and after about 1945. Whatever cultural differences exist between traditional small towns and traditional big cities, small towns and big cities share formal similarities that distinguish both from post-1945 sprawl development. What are some of these characteristics? Next slide. Foremost is that traditional towns and city neighborhoods are walkable settlements characterized by the pedestrian proximity of a variety of uses and activities. One elementary measure of traditional urbanism is the mix of uses that exist within a distance of a quarter to half mile, a 5 to 10 minute walk for most human beings. And you see here three well-known European cities, Venice on the left, Amsterdam in the center, the historic center of Florence on the right, all at the same scale, and the historic city centers of each almost bounded by this half-mile diameter circle. Next. Foremost among these shared characteristics of traditional urbanism is that traditional towns and city neighborhoods are walkable settlements characterized by the pedestrian proximity of a variety of uses and activities. One elementary measure of traditional urbanism is the mix of uses that exist within a distance of a quarter to half mile, a 5 to 10 minute walk for most human beings. The fundamental unit of urban design is the walkable mixed-use neighborhood. And one way to think of this is that a neighborhood or two standing alone constitutes a village or small town. Next slide. While an accumulation of neighborhoods constitutes a larger or smaller city. Next slide. In the latter case, a neighborhood is to a city as a slice of pizza is to the whole pie, a part that contains the same essential ingredients as the whole. In contrast, a post-1945 suburb, here's your slice of pizza, similar to the whole pizza. In contrast, a post-1945 suburb separates all the ingredients of everyday life into allegedly functional zones, inaccessible to pedestrians. So in the case of a pizza, it's as though you put the crust here and the sauce over there and the pepperoni over there and the cheese over there. And so you have all the ingredients of a pizza, but you don't have a pizza because what makes a pizza is the form of the pizza. In a similar way, suburbia separates all the elements of city life, and in separating them, it is not urban. Next slide. Finally, traditional urban settlements exhibit a hierarchy of spatial and building form, a hierarchy characterized by a reciprocal relationship between public spaces and the more prominent religious and civic foreground buildings. These are all examples of foreground buildings in Cooperstown, New York. Next slide. There's a reciprocal relationship between public spaces and the more prominent religious and civic foreground buildings, but also a reciprocal relationship between the public spaces and less prominent domestic and commercial background buildings. Next slide. And then when you put the two together, right, when you put the singular foreground buildings and the similar background buildings together, you have the city. Foreground buildings, background buildings, and a network of streets and squares, made up of blocks that form a network of streets and squares. Next slide. Now, note here again that in traditional cities, all of these civic, commercial, residential, and recreational buildings and uses are within pedestrian proximity of each other, typically not more than a 5 to 10 minute, 1/4 to 1/2 mile walk. This is the historic physical and anthropological measure of good urban culture. And I want to put forth a hypothesis that I cannot here develop in depth, but which perhaps we can discuss in the question and answer session. The hypothesis is this, that the prevalence of this traditional kind of settlement and its relationship to human physiology raises the question of whether we have discovered a heretofore overlooked precept of what the Catholic and Thomist intellectual tradition call the natural law. Next slide. If so, I would suggest that it is not a self-evident natural law precept. Rather, it is one that, like the idea of subsidiarity, has always existed implicitly within the natural law tradition, but needed to be made explicit by a historical moment when it had come to be widely violated. So, in light of the traditional urban forms at which we have been looking, consider as a natural law proposition that, quote, that human beings should make walkable mixed-use settlements. Right? That's the proposition. Human beings should make walkable mixed-use settlements. I'm not going to say anything more about this now, except for the following, in answer to a commonly expressed objection that my hypothesis is simply a mask for anti-modern and anti-automobile sentiment. It is not. If this is truly a natural law precept, it does not presume that everyone who lives in their neighborhood necessarily does or should work in their neighborhood. Nor does it mean that neighborhood residents will or should cease to have cars. It does mean that a significant reduction in car travel is possible, that residents who are unable to drive a car remain able to live a relatively independent life in their community, and that in such an arrangement, a car becomes a convenience rather than a necessity. Now, the formal characteristics of traditional towns and urban neighborhoods are easily learned by attending carefully to the most beloved cities and neighborhoods in the world. indeed by attending to the formal arrangement of virtually any pre-1945 human settlement. Nevertheless, making traditional towns and neighborhoods today is very hard, not only because we have largely lost the requisite cultural and social habits of neighborhood making, but also because in most places zoning laws, which mandate segregation of uses, and street design regulations, which are crafted exclusively to make streets efficient for cars rather than also safe for pedestrians, these two things alone make it literally illegal to build traditional neighborhood environments. So can the art of traditional urban design be renewed? And just as importantly, can we learn once again to be happy in traditional towns and cities, not only as a moral antidote to individualism, inequality, and the misuse of environmental resources, and not only as an aesthetic antidote to suburban sprawl, but also for the sake of the genuine goods and pleasures, including both communal belonging and individual freedom, of traditional urban life? These are the questions that have been taken up over the past 17 years by the Congress for the New Urbanism. Next slide. The question is frequently asked, what's new about New Urbanism? The novelty of New Urbanism is not the formal order it advocates, but rather its promotion of traditional neighborhoods in a physical context of suburban sprawl and the cultural context that promotes it. So even though New Urbanism is promoting something different from the contemporary status quo, that is, something new, it is also promoting something tested, something that we know works. New Urbanism is the attempt to employ, which also necessarily has entailed relearning, in our current circumstances, the best practices of city making from the past toward the end of making better cities for the future. New Urbanism explicitly and conscientiously sets itself against conventional single-use zoning sprawl development. But is this opposition to sprawl a mere aesthetic affront, and hence, as some would no doubt view it, simply a matter of taste, if not outright snobbery? Is sprawl, at worst, just an inefficient use of land, or are there more serious problems here of which sprawl is a symptom and to which sprawl is a contributor? The Congress for New Urbanism was founded in 1992 with the primary objective of promoting traditional urbanism as an alternative to sprawl development. Although its members include politicians, academics, engineers, environmentalists, journalists, developers, and stay-at-home moms, it's a movement founded by architects and urban designers whose first objection to sprawl is largely aesthetic. This may at first glance seem elitist, but part of my particular New Urbanist argument is that urban aesthetics are marks of cultural character, and also that the aesthetics of sprawl are in fact physical markers of a larger cultural condition, the problems of which go far beyond aesthetics. Beyond the aesthetic issues, the primary arguments against sprawl are that because it generates external costs borne unevenly by others, it is unjust, and that it is also culturally and environmentally unsustainable. How so? Here are some observable problems attributable to or associated with sprawl, problems that are either direct consequences or unintended byproducts of sprawl's formal patterns of development. Sprawl makes it impossible for people of different generations and different incomes to live in proximity to one another and to work, shop, play, learn, and worship in the same neighborhood. Sprawl effectively demobilizes and disenfranchises those without cars and those unable to drive, notably children, whose parents must become chauffeurs, and the elderly. Sprawl injures the common good by concentrating both wealth and poverty, by separating people by income, age, and race, and by failing to provide a genuinely public realm shared by all. Because sprawl separates housing settlements by class, and because of the nature of our public education system, it promotes extreme inequality of educational opportunity. Sprawl hastens the loss of agricultural lands and wilderness, and the settlements that it creates are not worth the trade-off. Sprawl, by its automobile-dependent lifestyle, contributes to unprecedented rates of obesity. Sprawl is ugly and produces nothing in the public realm worthy of aesthetic contemplation. Although suburbia has become a cultural ideal, it is a contradictory ideal because sprawl consumes the landscape that is the very substance of its promise. And finally, because sprawl cannot deliver on its promise of convenience, mobility, natural beauty, individual freedom, and well-being for all, its self-contradictory dynamic is culturally problematic and undermines the common good. This is evidenced in part by the observation that often the persons most recently arrived at the fringes of suburbia are also the persons most vociferously opposed to its continuing extension, the political phenomenon that has come to be known as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Next slide. The specific task undertaken by new urbanists is the revival and creation of traditional towns and neighborhoods in a physical context of sprawl and the legal and cultural context that promotes it. One of the intellectual tools increasingly employed, now regularly employed by new urbanists, is called the transect, an idea promoted by new urbanists not only as an intellectual construct, but also as a discovery and articulation of a general principle of both land use and historic human settlement. The Transect Diagram, shown in two different forms, and there's a zillion different ways to depict this idea that I'm going to talk about, but here are two common ones. The one up above is a planned section view that Dwani Plotter-Zyber has been developing for many years, and the one on the right is just a graphic, a drawing by Leon Creer of T-zones, zones T2 through T6. The transect diagram, any transect diagram, depicts 6 distinct transect zones, T1 through T6. And again, think of this as like, there's nothing magic about the number 6. Think about a sausage, right? That you have one sausage, you can slice it any number of ways. Well, the transect, you've got this, it represents sort of the totality of good, of environments in which human beings can flourish, and it's sliced 6 ways for reasons that I'm gonna talk about. But there's nothing magic about the slicing. Anyway, the transect diagram depicts 6 distinct transect zones, T1 through T6. Zones T1 and T2 refer to rural transect zones in the most general way, insofar as they relate to the development of human habitat. The urban transect, strictly speaking, is described by zones T3 through T6, and together with the rural transect zones constitute the rural to urban transect proper. The rural to urban transect seeks and purports to describe the general conditions of good human settlements. Not all of them, but certain key elements of good human settlements, and can itself be used as the basis for locally particular zoning codes. In this respect, the transect is analogous to natural law, and particular zoning ordinances are like positive law. In fact, they are positive law. There is not, I should emphasize this, there is not unanimity of opinion among new urbanists about the definition of the urban transect that I'm about to give. But for our purposes this evening, I'm going to define the urban transect as follows. The rural to urban transect is a diagram of human habitat describing the relationship of the rural environment to traditional urban environments. The rural transect proper, zones T1 and T2, designate areas generally not subject to human settlements larger than the family, and differentiates between natural landscapes both raw and preserved, and cultivated landscapes. The T1, the natural zone, is a natural landscape. The T2 is a cultivated landscape. The urban transect refers in turn to that range of human habitats that support human flourishing, within which human settlements are part of a sustainable ecosystem that includes both natural and cultivated landscapes. This range of human habitats, depicted as transect zones, progresses from less dense human settlements, T3, to more dense human settlements, T6. Or to most dense human settlements, well, more dense human settlements, T6. But each urban transect zone, and this is critical, each urban transect zone denotes a walkable and mixed-use human environment wherein within each urban T-zone, many, if not most, of the necessities and activities of daily life are within a 5 to 10 minute walk for persons of all ages and economic classes. So what are the transect zones and what do they look like? Well, what they look like, of course, varies from place to place and from region to region. Next. Right, so this is just an example of a natural T1 zone. This is this is Empire, Michigan, which is a village, the village of Empire, Michigan. But this is the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Park, both here and in the foreground, in the background and in the foreground. This is sort of northwestern Michigan on the coast of Lake Michigan. And this is an example. I mean, the natural zone T1 is the least dense, it's the least urban, it's forest preserves, it's the natural landscape. This is an example of what we mean by natural, the T1 natural zone. Next. This is just a basic example of T2. T2 referring to all of the land, right? Or again, there's a walkable mixed-use human settlement there in the middle of this, but all this agricultural land tended by human beings, right, would be an example of what we mean by rural agricultural landscape or landscape tended by human beings. Next. With the suburban T3 zone, we enter into the least dense end of the urban transect gradation, and not coincidentally, the most problematic and controversial T-zone among new urbanists ourselves. The general characteristic of the T3 zone is that it allows for relatively low-density human habitat, detached houses of various sizes typically set back from street front property lines, that nevertheless exists within a pedestrian-friendly environment and within a 5 to 10 minute, quarter to half mile walk to a variety of daily life activities, such as would be common in a traditional village or in a low-density traditional urban neighborhood. The actual land use density of the suburban T3 zone may in fact be no different than the density of a sprawl residential subdivision. The difference between them is that the T3 zone is a mixed-use and walkable environment, whereas the sprawl subdivision is not. And I don't know if you're reading this, but this is the T3 zone right in here, right? So you get a sense of what the density is. So T4, T5, T6, and you can see the increased gradation of density. Next slide. The general urban T4 zone represents the next most dense type of urban land use. As shown in the diagram, buildings may be attached or detached, but the density remains fairly low. And although a mix of uses are permitted, the non-sacred or non-civic building types typically found in a T4 zone are commonly intended to be primarily residential. Nevertheless, as in every T zone, the environment is walkable and within pedestrian proximity of a variety of daily activities. Next slide. And so here are examples of the kind of density that you get in a T4. So T4 you should basically think of as sort of what there's the most of in a walkable urban neighborhood, in a walkable town or neighborhood. And so you can see the different kinds of densities that occur from the upper left, which depict Bruges, the lower left, Cooperstown, New York, the upper right, Nantucket, and the lower right, Chicago, where these are all multifamily houses, 2 flats and 3 flats and 12 flat corner apartment buildings, all part of T4 zone because that's what there's, in a certain sense, the most of in these particular settlements. Now, the point about a mix of uses, I should say something here that the example that I like to use is if you go to any town that was built, that has a settlement that existed prior to 1945, you'll find some big Victorian house somewhere on a corner in the middle of the block. And it was obviously it's a house. It's a house type. It was built as a house. It was meant to be occupied. But it's no longer a house. It's a lawyer's office. It's a bed and breakfast. It's a funeral parlor. It's some other use, right, that has been permitted within this particular building type. And the point about the transect is that the zoning is not based upon use. This is what differentiates it from contemporary zoning laws, is that it's not based upon use, it's based upon building type and upon density of the building type. And the assumption is that a mix of uses is permitted and that uses will change over time, and that if there are particular uses that you don't want, right, then you articulate what those are and you prohibit them rather than defining one specific strict use as the only thing that's permitted. Next. Okay, the urban center T5 zone represents the next most dense type of urban land use, and again may be characteristic of both small towns and large city neighborhoods. Here, unlike the T4 zone building types in which alternative uses are permitted but not presumed, T5 buildings are more often attached rather than detached and are of a type presumed and designed to accommodate different uses within the same building, most commonly residential or commercial uses located above ground floor retail activity. Next slide. And again, these are all examples of T5 zones. San Gimignano, Italy on the upper left, Chicago, Lincoln Avenue, Commercial Street on the right, New Orleans in the French Quarter, lower right, and Ripley, Ohio on the Ohio River on the lower left. Next. The final and most dense transect zone is the urban core T6 zone, which differs essentially from T5 zones only in terms of the former's higher densities of population and activities. There's debate among new urbanists about whether it is proper to characterize T6 densities as applicable to small towns. I think that it is not proper to do so. The kinds of densities characteristic of urban core T6 zones are such that they're really only typical of large cities. And new urbanists really have not yet addressed the issue of whether there are forms of human settlement that are in fact too dense to properly be considered as conducive to human flourishing and hence part of the urban transect. Nevertheless, the examples that new urbanists have in mind when we think of T6 zones are unquestionably some of the finest and most hospitable human habitats in the world. So that this illustration, of course, is Paris, next. And we have the Campo dei Fiori in Rome, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, Regent Street in London, Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. Next. Although diagrams of the idea of the transect properly illustrate it as a gradation according to density, it is a mistake to assume that the transect necessarily implies such exact shades of gradation in actual cities. Transect zones of very different densities are sometimes juxtaposed to one another to great effect, and transect-based zoning allows for just such juxtapositions. A dramatic example is illustrated here in this image of the 18th fairway of the Old Course at St. Andrews, Scotland, with the town of St. Andrews immediately hard up against the edge of the golf course. An example of a T2 rural zone, the Old Course, immediately adjacent to a T5 urban center, the town of St. Andrews. Next. An even more dramatic example, of course, occurs in New York City, with the juxtaposition of the rural T2 zone of Central Park immediately adjacent to the T6 zone of mid and uptown Manhattan. Next slide. Finally, if the proposition human beings should make settlements in accordance with human beings should make walkable mixed-use settlements really can be regarded as a natural law precept, how can and or does this precept serve as a basis for positive law? Here, new urbanists are much clearer in our thinking, even if there remains room for greater clarity. New urbanist efforts to promote traditional urbanism are typically supported by four kinds of transect-based legal documents in descending order of importance. First of all, a master plan. Second, a regulating plan. Third, an urban code. And fourth, a traditional neighborhood district ordinance. The first and foremost of these is the master plan, which is a set of documents that illustrate a positive vision for the development of a particular town, neighborhood, or parcel of land. An example of a master plan drawing and just a few supporting illustrations is shown here for a project done about several years ago for a neighborhood in Greensboro, North Carolina, which Milton Grenfell, who's been forwarding these slides, and I worked on together in 2002. Next slide. The second legal document, the regulating plan, is entirely in service to the vision illustrated in the master plan. As a color-coded diagram, it bears a superficial resemblance to contemporary color-coded zoning maps, but the resemblance is entirely superficial. The difference is that the typical zoning ordinance color codes according to use, whereas the transect-based regulating plan color codes according to transect zones. That is to say, according to density and building type rather than according to use, because it is a premise of transect-based zoning that uses should be mixed and also that uses will change over time. Next slide. The third legal document, the Urban Code, likewise follows from, builds upon, and supports the intentions of the master plan and regulating plan. It identifies and illustrates examples of the building types permitted in the variety of lot conditions that occur on blocks within specific T-zones that are identified in the master and regulating plans. And it also provides guidance in the form of simple diagrams as to the location of buildings on their lot, minimum and maximum building heights, the quantity and location of any required off-street parking, and the range of permitted uses. Illustrated here is a page for buildings on corner lots of a T5 urban center zone. Next slide. And illustrated here is a page, or two pages actually, for building on mid-block lots in a T4 urban general zone, or general urban zone. I would note that there are as many pages in the Urban Code as there are typical conditions in the master plan. But for any typical traditional town or urban neighborhood, the code may be as small as 20 illustrated pages. I'm not here illustrating an example of a T&D ordinance, which is primarily a written rather than illustrated document, but which again exists to support the positive vision that's put forth in the transect-informed master plan and the transect-based regulating plan and urban code. Next slide. Let me conclude with the point that building in accordance with the urban transect is a necessary but not sufficient condition for good human settlements, urban settlements. Just as articulation of the practical implications of other natural law precepts are necessary but not sufficient conditions for living a good life. And this is for essentially the same reason, because it is necessary for us to conform our own actions with the natural law. Even though good cities facilitate the good life and bad cities tend to discourage it, even the best city cannot make us good. But the merit of the natural law intellectual tradition for new urbanists is that it allows us to argue in good faith for why traditional urbanism is a genuine good and why sprawl is objectively problematic. Just as importantly, the natural law tradition draws us away from modernist temptations to biological and or social determinism, not by denying the forces of biology and society, but rather by the natural law tradition's dogged insistence that character is the key to civilization, not only in terms of social justice and human happiness, but also in terms of artistic creation and aesthetics. The natural law tradition reminds us that it is a false objective to seek for what T.S. Eliot called, quote, social arrangements, and by extension formal arrangements, so perfect that they will make us good, end quote. And it allows those of us who are architects and urban designers to steer ourselves away from sterile notions of the zeitgeist and personal authenticity in favor of the fecund language of craftsmanship and of moral and intellectual and artistic excellence. Finally, and not least, the rigorous natural law intellectual tradition also leaves open to us the life of the spirit, the life that understands itself in relation to large and wondrous and necessarily mysterious paradigms of ultimate human happiness, such as the one we saw depicted in the Ghent altarpiece. Mysteries that reveal themselves in part in the most beautiful environments that human beings have built, but mysteries that are also the very origin and the very destiny of all our building. Thank you very much.
Now we have a time to take a few questions if you'd like to ask Mr. Bess something after his inspiring talk. Here you are.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for the kind of community that we're trying to rebuild here.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's possible at a large scale. I mean, I don't think that there is any national community per se, although there are certainly things that I think if push comes to shove, can you hear me? No. What I was going to say is that the question was, is traditional urban traditional urbanism possible in the absence of shared communal values? And my inclination is actually to think that it's not. That traditional urbanism is a physical expression of communal values. But that the question, I think to the extent that we're looking at this as something that is sort of a nationwide movement, right, that is going to be rapidly achieved. I don't see that. I mean, there's a whole lot of structural reasons why that's not possible. The way that the economy is organized, the way that the building construction industry is organized, the propensity of Americans to get up and move frequently, the pressures on us to do so, the assumptions that this is a kind of normal way of life. I think mitigate against the reestablishment of traditional urbanism as at this point in anything more than a kind of, I want to say a kind of niche market actually for people who have a certain kind of aesthetic. At least that's I think that's what we're seeing now in terms of the new urbanist developments that are being made. Now there's a couple things I need to add to that. One is that one of the basic criticisms of new urbanism is that it's because it works so closely with the developer housing industry, has worked so closely with the developer housing industry, which is why a lot of new urbanists right now are out of work, is that one of the criticism is that new urbanists are making just a nicer form of suburb, if you will. It has certain environmental benefits, but it really, in terms of of the way that suburbia functions or is dysfunctional in the way that I sort of described, that exists too in these new urbanist settlements. That new urbanist settlements too, many if not most of them are inhabited by individualists, not who are ideological individualists, but just because as moderns we're all infected by that. So I think that there's a couple of things to say about that. One is that one of the differences between new urbanist developments that are being done and conventional sprawl development is that the new urbanist developments, at least by virtue of their physical infrastructure, they have the potential to become genuine communities. This is going to happen over generations. People are going to have to be born in these places and die in these places. They're going to have to be real, serious religious communities that begin to form and inhabit these places over time. And Andras Dwani often says that critics of new urbanism take the time factor out of their evaluation of new urbanist projects, and I think that that's true. At the same time, I think, and in fact, it's one of the projects one of the intellectual interests that most, one of the intellectual issues that most interests me is what kinds of communities exist in the United States today that would be candidates for making human settlements that could be genuinely traditional, durable, beautiful. I'll cite just one example. One possibility, and it's not going to happen, but I've shared with some people at Notre Dame the idea that Notre Dame, because of its financial resources and because of what it purports to be, that it wants to be, I think it would be possible for Notre Dame to be a patron of traditional architecture and urbanism. Not just sponsor a school that does this, but actually be a patron, that you could actually. There are institutions that if they're wealthy enough, right, they can subsidize a culture of building that would make it possible to create genuinely durable, sustainable, genuine communities. I think that the value of that kind of thing is to serve as a model for what might happen, but I don't see it happening as on a wide scale in the immediate future. Yeah, Connor. My access to bishops is limited, but I will say this, that one of the issues of, again, it's one of the paradoxes, and in some ways very predictable about new urbanism is that it's very expensive, right? Is that it has become very expensive. It's become very expensive because it's a high quality living environment, which is what makes places expensive, is that they're desirable. And so I'll share a story actually that Steve Muzan, who's a fellow new urbanist, I read something recently that he'd written about this, that several years ago he was thinking, in early 90s, he and his wife were thinking about buying a 700 square foot cottage in Seaside, and the price was $290,000 for a 700 square foot cottage. And they said that he would buy it, if the summer rentals could pay the mortgage. And they did the calculations, and they figured that after they calculated it, they realized they couldn't afford it, so they didn't buy it. 2 years later, so it sold. 2 years later, it came back on the market for, and what he was noting was the flipping of the numbers, $920,000. He noticed that 2 years after that, it came back on the market for $2.9 million. Now, this is insane. This is crazy. And so, and we've all, we've sort of, I think that kind of road is we're not going to see as much of that in the future as we've seen in the recent past. But here's the thing about housing and about affordability of housing is that the only way that you can have housing that is both, well, as Anders Dewani likes to say, affordable housing is housing that nobody wants, right? Affordable housing is bad housing. South Bend, Indiana is full of affordable housing, if you ever visited South Bend. And so the only way that really you can have good housing, well-built, durable housing that is also affordable is housing that is very small. Now, there are some very interesting paradigms for that, in fact. Ancient and modern, or at least I should say medieval and modern. We take our urban design students every year. We go a lot of places. One of the places we go is Bruges, Belgium, which, if you know anything about Bruges, it was a very wealthy city in the Middle Ages, and a lot of that housing stock is intact. But it also had a lot of there's a beguinage there. There were houses that were built for religious communities, housing that was subsidized or built, for the poor and the indigent, that is still in use today. It was that well built. I mean, these buildings are 300 years old, 400 years old. They are immaculate. They're beautiful, but they're about, dwelling units of about 400 square feet. So much smaller than what any American, right? Although people who live in Greenwich Village know something about that, right? They'll pay a premium for a very small apartment. But so we go there. Another place we go, though, is to Starkville, Mississippi, where there's a guy by the name of Dan Camp in Starkville, Mississippi, who over a period of 30 or 40 years has developed a 10-block area adjacent to Mississippi State University called the Cotton District. And what he does is he does about 5 or 6 buildings per year as rental student apartment housing. But he builds very well. He makes his own windows. He does durable buildings, uses good material, and rents his buildings for about the same amount of money that rentals go elsewhere in Starkville. But all of his buildings are about 375 to 500 square feet. And so that's it's one of those things that I'm interested in, particularly at Notre Dame, for example, where you could actually build student housing along that model that would be urban and durable and could promote a culture of traditional building and traditional urbanism. But I think that that's what it takes for affordability and affordability in good buildings. I think we have to build smaller. Yeah, in the back. That's a very complex subject. Actually, one of the things about Nathan Glazer has been writing critical essays about modern architecture and modern urbanism for about the last 20 years. Recently collected into a book, and I'm blanking on the name of the book. Anyway, a really excellent collection of essays. But in it, he it's called From a Cause to a Style: Modern Architecture and its Effects on the American City. And in it, he points out that it began as this kind of revolutionary thing, and then it became a style. And one of the things that actually is this sort of dirty little secret, I think, is that architects, well, Philip Johnson, who I'm not a big fan of, but he occasionally had a good insight, once described architecture as the world's second oldest profession. And you know, I think that you should never underestimate that the desire of architects to build. And the sort of the general, it's not true of all architects. Certainly, it's not true of my friend Milton here, you know. Who, but a lot of architects will take, you know, whatever work they can get for whatever reason. So there's a sense in which I think that the ideology, in some ways, was a kind of a mask for self-interest. But I do think, though, that the way that it was presented. It was revolutionary, but it was certainly it was presented as promoting a good. That's all that I meant in describing it as a reform movement. That it was a reaction to the squalor of the industrial city, all of its themes of hygiene, of cleanliness, of health. You know, that these were all things that were prompted directly by the kinds of conditions that were produced by the industrial city. Yeah. Who only has time for one more question? I can be here all night. So.
Informal question.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a sense in which traditional urbanism is making a virtue out of conditions of limitation and scarcity. I mean, I think that the fact that all these historic city centers, you had these mix of uses, you know, within close proximity to each other. That this is completely natural for a creature that lacks mechanized means of transportation. I mean, my point about suggesting that it's how we should build cities now is not that mechanized means of transportation are a bad thing, but that if the mechanized means of transportation go away, right, we're completely stuck. And so there's a sense in which traditional urbanism and traditional urban form, I mean, it promotes a whole lot of goods. It doesn't preclude changes in technology and things like that. But it doesn't leave us hung out to dry if things go bad on the one hand. On the other hand, it has its own kinds of pleasures. Now, you're asking to what extent are these actually designed. And the reality is that people living in a place over periods of generations, acquire habits of behavior related to the place in which they live, where if they love the place, they try to make it better, right? I mean, Chesterton has a great quote, you know, about Rome, right? He said that we may love Rome because it was great, but Rome first became great because it was loved, and that's exactly true. You can follow the history of the development of Rome from these, you know, sort of mud hut settlements to what Rome became. And it became that way in part as a consequence of conscious design. It became that way in part of just, it's a kind of a natural thing that happens when people live together in a place. And I think that one of the critical issues today, and it's interesting, when you think about the Benedictine model of human settlement, that the vows that the Benedictines take, as I understand them, right, are poverty and chastity and I'm blanking on stability of life, right? And the key issue is stability of life. They take a vow to stay in the same place, you know, for the rest of their lives. And I think that the key to developing genuinely communal, durable, beautiful human settlements is a population that stays there over the course of multiple generations. And nobody's suggesting, I'm certainly not suggesting, that this is something that can be or should be enforced by law, but it really requires a kind of voluntary asceticism, a voluntary self-limitation. And that's an intentional thing. And I think that I think it's the future of good traditional urbanism. I think that it was also part of the historic development of good cities.